guest, Christopher Knight. Chris became a writer almost by accident, as his curiosity into Freemasonry and megalithic structures led to a series of books written and co-written about this deep and deserving rabbit hole, including titles like Civilization 1, Solomon's Power Brokers, Who Built the Moon, Before the Pyramid, and most recently, God's Blueprint. A topic I can't wait to get into with the man who knows the plan, Christopher Knight. Welcome to THC.
Thank you, Greg. Good to be with you.
I do concur, good sir, and I'm very excited for this. The subject matter you've been studying and the connections you've made really do blow my mind. And I suppose a good place to start is at the beginning, which I believe was an interest in Freemasonry, right?
Completely accidental beginning, yeah. In my early 20s, I thought, what do these guys get up to? I've read bad things about them and some good things, and I thought the best way to find out is to join, but that didn't throw any light on it at all. So I spent many decades trying to find out where their rituals came from.
Right on. So yeah, the rituals of Freemasonry, they seem shrouded in mystique, and that leads to all sorts of rumors. But seeing as how you've gone through some of these rituals firsthand, can you detail some of the strangeness you encountered with them?
Yes, because there's very, very little that's actually secret in Freemasonry. And when my first book came out, a lot of Freemasons thought I was telling secrets, but I have never, ever once told a secret I wasn't allowed to tell, because there really aren't too many. But I joined to try and find out what these guys got up to, and the rituals were seriously weird, every bit as weird as I expected, and stranger again. And then after a couple of years, I kept saying, well, what's this about? You know, we do these rituals to bring in candidates, and then we do more rituals to bring in more candidates. What's the output? Nobody knew, and nobody knew where the rituals came from. So I thought I need to try and find out. I mean, they're seriously strange. And most Freemasons will tell you, oh, I can't tell you what I do because it's a secret. But it isn't a secret at all. They don't tell you because they're embarrassed, because if they told you what they did, it would seem like, you do what? That's crazy. Why'd you do that? And they'd have to say, I don't know, really. You know, it's easier to say, well, I can't tell you. You know, it's all secret, but it's not at all. The only secrets are the means of recognition, which are completely ceremonial and totally unimportant. The actual rituals are published, you know. So most of them, it gets more tricky when you get to the 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite, but there's a little more shrouding going on there, but there's all sorts of degrees around the world, which I've joined many of them and been involved with many of them. But I've kept relatively junior in mainstream Freemasonry deliberately so that I can learn more without being compromised. But all of the basic degrees, obviously, I went through in the 1970s.
Interesting. And I know you did also put a lot of energy into tracing Freemasonry back as far as you could. There seems to be a lot of different theories and ideas on the subject, but what did your research show when you looked into it?
Well, you don't need to get too theoretical about it, because there is a great deal of evidence. It takes a lot of digging out. I've managed to get back about 6,000 years. I originally expected to get back 400 or 500 years, because I have no interest in the esoteric or weird ideas or anything that I used to think of as airy-fairy. And I thought it was just very matter-of-fact. It's far from matter-of-fact. And it's very complicated. But there is hard evidence of connections. A guy called Robinson did some fantastic work connecting modern Freemasonry with the Templars. That was one of the early routes that I checked out. He wrote Born in the Blood, and became a Freemason on his deathbed, in actual fact. And it was relatively easy. It only took a few years to substantiate that was correct, that the Knights Templar, or the rituals used by the Knights Templar, appear to be the source of the core rituals within Freemasonry. So I then spent 20 years finding out where the Templars got their rituals from by tracing back ancient Judaism.
Man, that's interesting. So you trace Freemasonry back 6,000 years, this tradition, back to the Knights Templar. That's well established. If we go before that, are there any groups that had this body of knowledge that we might recognize or are worth noting?
Well, a body of knowledge it is, for sure. But that makes it sound like it's something in a chest very contained. It's much more, it's much broader than that. But what I found is the Knights Templar who dug in the Temple of Jerusalem in the early 12th century had found all sorts of things that turned them from being poverty-stricken nomarchs into the world's richest, most influential people within a handful of years. And so what I wanted to try and find out is what they had found and how they'd found it under the Temple of Jerusalem. And the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD by Titus, the Romans, who killed 1.3 million Jews, according to the available evidence, in this terrible war. And the Jews, the Essenes in particular, hid their documentations under the Temple of Jerusalem and in other places, such as Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, which record what was buried under the Temple in Jerusalem, tell us exactly where they were and what was buried. So everything was put underground at this period in the first century, very shortly after the killing of Jesus Christ and his brother James. This terrible war sprang up and everything was buried. So I had to try and work out what it was that these people possessed that they buried that could have been dug up. And to do that, this was purely for personal interest. I wasn't thinking of writing a book or sharing the information with anybody particularly. I went back to the earliest known times of pre-Judaism and reconstructed what it could be that they buried. And I didn't expect to succeed, but I pretty well had a clear idea because there are 2 or 3 strands of Judaism, and modern Judaism is little connected to the Enochian Judaism that was very, very important in that period. So it is somewhat complex, but for sure it follows down that route. But as you go back further in time, it gets richer and more diverse, but the evidence gets harder. My first book, The Hiram Key, was fairly philosophical, trying to put things together and make sense of patterns. And people could say, well, I disagree with that. And I'd say, fine, okay, disagree. But the evidence suggests to me this, and this. But as the years have gone by, particularly recent or relatively recent years working with Alan Butler, it's hard science. We only deal in testable, checkable facts. So it isn't the case that someone can say, well, I disagree with that. You say, why? Where's your evidence? We're talking about testable, checkable, scientific facts now, which is very unusual in this arena because archaeologists and theologists can be the world's worst for coming up with grand theories of the way things are because they've got a wonderful degree from the right university and they think their opinion is therefore extremely valuable to mankind rather than actually setting out to prove what they're saying is correct. So it's somewhat unusual to be dealing with hard facts in this type of arena. But on this journey, particularly in recent years, I've undergone a major change in what I accept as being real, because I was very, very sort of matter of fact and very disapproving of what you might call fringe theories. But now I'm in possession of what is deemed by many to be a fringe theory, but yet I have the evidence to substantiate it. And many heavy-duty scientists have looked at it and said, my God, yeah, you're right. That's checkable, testable, and correct. So there's a bit of a battle going on here, but sort of standard wisdoms get passed down universities, even though they're complete bunkum. So it takes a generation to shift some old nonsense.
Yeah, I hear that. And it is just a fascinating amount of research you've done. And I guess to segue into the study of measurements, that's kind of where a lot of this evidence gets into some really outrageous concepts that I don't think many people are familiar with. But talk to us about how this interest in Freemasonry led you into this study of measurements.
Well, everything I've done, even though the various books I've written seem to be on, or can appear to be on, quite different subjects, everything is a continuum. Everything follows through. But there was something of a break point, and that's, I guess, when Alan Butler read some of my material, and he contacted me and said, I don't quite know why, but he said, I think my work is meeting your work here. And true enough, when I met him, it was indeed. And the origins of Freemasonry lay in the understanding of stones, but not stones for building houses per se. It's stones that were used in astrological observation. And in ancient, super ancient times, things like Stonehenge and structures that were built to observe the moons of stars and planets and so forth. That's what the stonework was all about, like the ancient monuments. And there was a particular period when Alan and I stepped back to look at some work done by one engineer from Oxford University, a renowned professor of mathematics. The building of mathematics at Oxford University is named after him today, the Alexander Thom building. Now, this guy was a genius, and he spent 50 years surveying megalithic sites, and he identified that there was a standard unit of measurement, or a series of measurements around this one core unit that had been used that is more accurate than anything we do today in terms of building. It's like human hair's width. And everyone thinks that the Stone Age period was completely the Flintstones, sort of rough and ready, sort of playing your records with the beak of some bird,
Right.
But it wasn't. It was super science. And he argued this, and the archaeologists said, "Oh, you're an idiot. You're just an engineer from Oxford University. What do you know about archaeology? We shall ignore you because you're wrong." And he said, "Look, I don't know why I'm right, but I've surveyed hundreds and hundreds of sites over 50 years from northern Scotland down to western France. And I tell you, this unit was used everywhere over 1,000 years and thousands of square miles." So I came up with the one thought, which was, if this unit of measurement really did exist, it wouldn't be an abstraction. Someone didn't wake up one day and say, "Hey, I think this is a really neat length. Let's everyone use it."
Right.
What is it? What's this length? Well, it's just the length of this stick. So let's make this the holy stick. He admitted that wouldn't work. You couldn't do it. It physically wouldn't work. So my gamble was that somehow there was something in nature that was repeatable. Everyone could, in isolation, if they knew how to do it, could work this out. Well, it doesn't take too long to work out that there's only one thing. Thomas Jefferson did it when he set out to make a new system of measurements for the new USA, although they weren't adopted, and that is the movement of the Earth on its axis, which is perceived as the stars moving overhead. So if you can measure the movements of those stars appropriately, you can produce units of length, of time, of weight, of mass, of capacity, of everything, even temperature.
Wow.
And it all stems, that was the hunch. And very, very quickly, bingo, we found exactly, because it's so basic and so important, exactly what he did. And then afterwards, after publishing the book to say this, we found the archaeological evidence that fitted it. Now, the proof of any good theory is to subsequently find evidence that bears it out. Well, that's exactly what happened. We found huge amounts of really important archaeological evidence that just bears this out completely. So it's turned from opinion and theory to check out the facts, man,
Yeah.
Let's not debate nonsense. Let's debate some hard facts. Get your ruler out. Check this. But the really seriously weird thing, of course, is that this system that existed 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, which is very demonstrably there, is not something that disappeared. It is the basis of the imperial measurement system. It is the basic of the metric system. Both are two halves of the same thing and can be tracked back, and they're both perfectly astronomically perfect within this system, which shows an understanding not only of the Earth, but of the moon and the sun as well.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing. And
it's crazy.
It is. And let's look at some of that archaeological evidence. What are some of the first big structures we see using this set of measurements? Some of the henges, right?
Exactly. The really astonishing ones we found were not far from where I live in Yorkshire, in England, which is a happy coincidence for me because I've traveled all around the world looking at all sorts of things. So it's just very strange that it's relatively close to my home. But they were building these things 5,500 years ago, before they started building in stone. And there are 3 gigantic henges, which are circular earthworks, which are still there. And they're 1,000 years older than the pyramids of Giza. And they are the pyramids of Giza are an exact copy of them.
Right.
The center is identical. It's reduced scale because the pyramids aren't as big, but they're for exactly the same purpose. The really interesting thing is, once you understand the principles that had to be used to site the pyramids of Giza near Cairo, all the calculations were done in England at this site. It's very evident that, I don't know whether the Egyptian astronomers came to this location to borrow this 1,000-year-old information, or whether the people that built it 1,000 years earlier were Egyptians that had come to this site, because it's very astronomically important point on the Earth. So I'm not saying that us Brits invented the pyramids at all. Don't know who did it. All I know is where they did what and how and when, because you can work all that out from the astronomical effects. And the pyramids, for sure, are a copy of Orion's belt. A good friend of mine, Robert Baval, has written hugely about that Orion arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
In my view, he's got it slightly upside down, but we still have heated debates about that, Robert and I. But the fact remains that this site is 1,000 years older, far bigger, and exactly the same layout is in the UK here. And the dimensions of it are perfect for the measurement of the system of measurement that we'd identified from this Professor Alexander Thom, to the point where they are so detailed and so accurate that they led us to understand a very special nature of pi. And we were contacted by a professor in Canada who happens to have a PhD in physics and in chemistry, which is unusual. And he said, this is actually a breakthrough for mathematics, let alone archaeology. How on earth have you done this? And we said, well, we didn't do it. These ancients did it. All we've done is spot it. Mm-hmm. So these are very, very important sites. And little known, they're at a place called Thornbury. And there are tens of thousands of sites in Western Europe that show exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I think that would surprise some people, that Stonehenge really is just one of many henges, many stone circles out there. And
a very recent one, a very young one.
Yeah, Stonehenge being one of the youngest. And there's not a lot of researchers out there making that connection between these henges and Egypt. I mean, that and the pyramids. I mean, that's pretty radical. To play devil's advocate, do you think that these two different groups could have stumbled upon this information independently, kind of like Jefferson did, or is there evidence that there was actually a connection?
That's a good question, because for sure there are some basic science facts that would cause people to stumble on the same things as you say, as Thomas Jefferson did. But that is not the case, because there are too many connections. Like the basic unit of area that was adopted for use in ancient Egypt is identical to that used at Stonehenge. There clearly was an interchange between the two cultures, or it was one culture. There may have been an international priesthood that exchanged ideas and went to different places on the surface of the planet to get different astronomical advantage. Because this Thornbury site, for example, is exactly 1/10 of the polar circumference of the Earth from the North Pole, and has other features as well. So they picked out these locations for very precise reasons. So it may well be that there was a single, what we might call priesthood or group of scientists. I mean, the priests are scientists for the same thing. Stonemasons, they were all, they're one and the same people.
Right.
It all went backwards a little bit when the kings rose up in Egypt, the period of the kings when they became vain and they wanted this magic, and they wanted to turn it into something that made them live forever. And the scientists will have gone, oh my God, what's he doing? It's not about that. It's much more important than that. But there again, having said that, there's very clear evidence that also what they were doing was directly connected to the essence of what being human is, and it had all sorts of connections to the way the brain functions. Their science was far from backward. And I speak here as someone that just doesn't believe this sort of stuff normally.
Right.
I've been an atheist to all intents and purposes all my life, and I'm no longer. And I've been very disbelieving of non-standard theories until relatively recently, and now I have to admit that I've had it wrong for many, many years.
Man. So much information. Me being conspiratorial minded, I'm definitely intrigued by the idea of an international priesthood looking for vantage points around the planet. I think that's pretty interesting. But you mentioned that you think Baval has it upside down when talking about Orion's belt and the pyramids. What do you mean by that? I think a lot of the listeners will be familiar with Baval's ideas. What do you mean by he has it backwards or upside down?
Yeah, sure. His main critics have said he appears to have it upside down, and he says nonsense. I've done this properly, and because it doesn't quite fit with Orion's belt, he said, "Well, they weren't that good or engineers. It couldn't be that perfect." And I said, "Look, Robert, look at it the other way up, and it is absolutely perfect, as indeed the Thornbury henges are." These guys were not dumb. They had methods which I believe I have at least one way of doing it, of transferring what you see in the sky onto the ground with huge accuracy, with very simple tools. But what I believe that they did is that they believed that the world above was on the same plane. So the people in the afterlife, the Duat, were looking down onto the pyramids. So the pyramids, if you were looking beyond the stars, if they were on a canopy, they would look the same looking down, whereas Robert's looking at them as a mirror image. They weren't a mirror image. They were looking straight down. So, wow. I believe the slight inaccuracy is due to the fact that he's got the wrong star at each end, the center star being the same in both cases.
Got you. Literally upside down.
Yeah, it is just a simple way of interpreting the way that they wrote about the afterlife. They looked down to the earth from above, and they saw that if you took the pinnacles of the pyramid, the three Giza pyramids, and the other pyramids upwards, they would map onto the stars under their feet, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a very simple way of looking at it, and it's then perfect. But Robert's got a lot of energy invested in the original argument and doesn't want to move. Good, fine. We continue to have the debates and over a few beers every now and again, because I have a house near where he lives in Spain. So we have get-togethers, and his brothers are very scientific. He's an architect, and so we have some good heated discussions. All good fun.
Right on, man. Sounds like a great place to be a fly on the wall. Now, the listeners should know we did just take a slight break to switch your microphone because I was noticing a crinkling sound in the background, maybe a loose wire or something, but I think it might have been a bit distracting, so we did change it up. But to hop back into this thing, when we're talking about ancients having superior knowledge and how this could be, one of the major ideas is that of an international priesthood, like you mentioned, culture seeders, or they've been called the Watchers, which I'm sure we've all heard of. In your work, you've also referred to them as an unidentified creative agency, and I like that term too. But you mentioned that there are localized differences in the material in the various pockets you found it used, but the commonalities are pyramid building and Venus worship, and it's a curious thing. But why do you think these two tenets were always so important?
Pyramids seem to appear in every culture around the world, and I don't quite understand that, other than they are artificial mountains, if you like. So if you want to reach to the gods, you go to the top of a mountain, traditionally. So if you don't have a mountain, or you don't have the mountain where you want it, you build a pyramid. And there were pyramids in the United States before Columbus, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They're in every culture. But the worship of Venus is very different. Because it is like a clock. Over 40 years, it perfectly measures time to an accuracy of a fraction of a second. So if you understand the movements of Venus every 8 years, and then more particularly every 40 years, you've got a superb calendar. And it was the way of timekeeping, the basis of timekeeping before atomic clocks were invented in the 1950s. So the tracking of Venus has always been super important to any scientifically orientated culture. And of course, science and astronomy has tended to become the basis of the magic and the voodoo as things regress somewhat. And lesser people who don't really understand the science think it's something to do with the gods and so on. So it sort of all merges. But It's heavy-duty science.
Hmm. Yeah, I think this thing about Venus is really so amazing, man. And I understand what you're saying about magical interpretations and regression, but I think there's a lot of real magic out there too. And I've heard the pentagram symbol itself, the five-pointed star, was derived from following the path of Venus. And I know you've done work on Rosslyn Chapel, which is another place where we see the path of Venus encoded, right?
Yeah, there's the Rosslyn Chapel has got really the six-sided star, which is the symbol of Jerusalem, because Rosslyn, it's not a chapel, never was a chapel, in my view, was built as a copy of the Jerusalem temple by the people who were the inheritors of the knowledge of the Knights Templar, who excavated under the temple between 1117 and 1127. Now, the six-sided star, the Star of David or the Star of Solomon or whatever you want to call it, which is two equilateral triangles on top of each other, is actually the astronomical zip code for Jerusalem, because if you measure the angles of the sunrise and sunset, they are 60 degrees. So they will naturally form that star. So that symbol is actually the symbol of Jerusalem, which was first adopted by the Knights Templar. It's not a Jewish symbol at all, or at least not a modern Jewish symbol. It's a super ancient Jewish symbol, but not Judaism of the synagogue of today. And in fact, the synagogues copied it from the Knights Templars in the Middle Ages because they thought, hey, that's pretty neat. So they started to use that six-sided star. But that is the basis of what's in Rosslyn Chapel. And a certain fiction writer that used Rosslyn Chapel in his best-selling book pinched my observation about that being the basis of Rosslyn Chapel, although he claimed it was carved into the floor, which it isn't. It's just the core of the design of the main structure.
Yeah, I find that so fascinating how they could even do something like that. But so we have this connection between some of these old megalithic sites. We have Stonehenge and a connection to the Great Pyramids. Obviously, the builders had the same set of measurements. That alone is pretty radical. But tell us how the moon actually fits into this context.
Well, I ended up writing a book provocatively called Who Built the Moon? Because Alan Butler and I wrote a book called Civilization 1, identifying the existence of these measurements, or this whole system of measurements from ancient times, based around what Professor Alexander Thom called the Megalithic Yard. We found that it was entirely geodetic in that it fits the Earth perfectly on the basis of a 366-degree Earth, because that's the number of degrees there were originally, because there are 366 rotations of the Earth in 1 year, and they considered one rotation to be a degree. It was later neatened up to 360 degrees in a circle just to make it more mathematically usable. But originally we were 366, and this unit of measurement is perfect on the Earth. Now, then we discovered that it's perfect on the moon. There are exactly 100 megalithic yards to a megalithic second on the moon. There are 366 on the Earth, and there are 40,000 on the sun. Perfect, to all measurable levels. And we tried every other planet in the solar system, nothing at all. But it works perfectly for those three bodies, which is highly improbable. And then you start to look at what else is known about the moon, and it goes beyond improbable, as many Soviet and latterly Russian scientists and American NASA scientists and scientists from all around the world have observed. The moon is a very, very strange object, and it displays all the characteristics of being artificially created and put in its position. The mathematics of its structure are such that it's completely a copy and a yin and yang of the Earth, not only for its dimension and its movements and its spin. Every aspect about it is a complete twin of the Earth. And this doesn't apply to any other known moon anywhere. It reeks of a blueprint. There's design going on.
Right. Yeah. You say in the book that it was built like a Swiss clock, and I really like that analogy. It is a hard pill to swallow for some that it could be artificial. I mean, something of that scope. But the more you look at space, I guess the more you see that the math is just too precise, that it couldn't have come about naturally.
I'm far from the first person, and Alan Butler, my co-researcher on this, we're far from the first people to say this. Lots of people have said it for different reasons. We're just bringing in new evidence that is like seriously hard, that supports what's already been said. Of course, the casual observer will say, what? That's ridiculous. Of course the moon's not. But then have they ever thought, why, an eclipse, is it perfectly the same size as the sun? Does it just completely block it out? It's because the moon is 1/400th of the diameter of the sun, but it's 1/400th of the distance away. So they fit perfectly. Not 399, 400. And these numbers keep reappearing. It's deliberate. As Professor Paul Davies, a physicist, says, if you want to communicate over huge periods of time, you don't do what SETI does, send out radio messages. You put lumps of rock in space to communicate a pattern. And anyone with intellect will go, hey, that's not natural. That's weird. And will start to pay attention. And that's apparently what is going on here. Now, okay, people may say, if they're listening now and think, that's ridiculous. Of course no one's built the moon. Well, that's fine. That's your theory. Try some facts. Look at the facts and then see if you can come back and say that. I mean, I would have laughed at it. I would have gone, oh my goodness, no, how silly. But having gone through the facts in detail, you got to come up and go, oh, I don't like this, but it's a fact. I have to know facts.
You got to. And whenever a radical idea like that is proposed, one of my favorite things is when you do realize just how often, like you said, you're not the first to come to this kind of conclusion. And as radical as it is, when you look back at certain free thinkers, certain intellectuals who came to the same conclusion, it becomes a little easier to entertain when you see from different decades, different time periods, smart people, smarter than me, who actually will go out on a limb and say something like that. There must be some real indications.
Lots and lots and lots of them. But you need to step aside and look in detail. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, for example, when he looked at ancient measurements, he said, how come a cubic foot of water holds exactly 1,000 fluid ounces of distilled water? He said, that is beyond all possibility. So he looked back at ancient measurements and said, something going on here from deep antiquity. This is not happenstance. This is not accident. There is some design, deep lost in history going on here. And he was as smart a guy you will ever come across. I mean, he and his fellow founding fathers were just like geniuses. But the work he did there with the tools that he had available was astonishing. But he's just one of many. There are all sorts of people coming to the same conclusions for different reasons. And it's very easy just to go with the status quo and think, oh, of course, the moon's a natural object. The fact it's completely different in its structure to anything known in the universe is, well, I didn't even know that and probably unimportant. It is important. Do learn it. Mm-hmm. These things are so important. If we want to understand our future, we have to understand our past. And if something is going on, something big is going on, of course we need to know about it.
Of course. And in terms of devolution, I really do see this. I mean, the old founding fathers did seem to be on a higher level versus the politicians of today. And then look at the writing and language of that time and how things are written at a 5th grade level today. It seems clear there's been regression, but I'm skeptical and I'm curious. Do you think it's some big unfortunate accident that we've gotten less intellectual, or is it the result of an orchestrated campaign from the top? Because behind the curtain, it seems like important knowledge is still traded and shared, just not with us.
I've spent quite a lot of years saying that that's a completely unnecessary conclusion and almost certainly wrong. But I'm certainly less sure now. Well, I know for a fact that there are certain people, or there is a group of people that are more advanced than, or haven't regressed as much as others have, that does exist. How much power they exert, I don't know, but they've been pretty important in Washington, D.C. over the last few hundred years.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds incredibly conspiratorial. And I've always sort of despaired of people that have those sorts of views, but the evidence is rock solid, you know.
Right. I love it, man. And a little bit more about the moon. I mean, this is so epic. Who could have done this? Could it have been the Cedars of Knowledge many, many years ago on a previous pop-in?
No. This is from the beginning of time. I mean, the moon is pretty well known to be largely made out of material removed from the Earth's surface, which is largely now the Pacific. It doesn't have a central core like the Earth. It has various gravitational fields just under its surface distributed around it. It's not natural. It doesn't have, and it's not dense enough. And its positioning is completely improbable. And its position now is exactly in the position to alert us to its importance. It hasn't always been in that position. It's moved out and out and out. So it's speaking to us now. And in my book, God's Blueprint, my most recent book, I've suggested that God has done this to make a connection. Now, I'm not talking about the God of religion.
Ooh, good.
I'm not any sort of, I don't belong to any religion. It's just there is an absence of words in the English language to describe what you're talking about. I'm talking about a higher being that designed everything and for sure designed the universe. And not only the solar system, but the universe 13.5 billion years ago. And in my view, the whole thing was done for one reason, and that was to produce humans. It sounds very arrogant, but I've got good reason for believing that to be the case. Obviously, I can't categorically prove that. I can prove that the solar system does, but the laws of the universe are completely improbable to produce us. So I certainly don't see any evidence that lots of people will argue with me with this, but I see no evidence of there being any other life, intelligent life, anywhere in the universe. I think we're it, and we have a huge responsibility as such, because we're the leading edge of the Creator, and that I call God, and this entity. And there are ways of explaining what this entity might be, but that's pure theory. But the fact is that it's pretty indisputable that there is a design going on here. I mean, take Professor Anthony Flew guy, for example. He was probably the greatest philosopher of his age. He died relatively recently, at a good old age, and he spent his entire career being a champion of atheism, writing books and papers, and his whole career, and very famous man, saying there is no need for religion. It's ridiculous. The idea of God's ridiculous. And he turned around at the end of his life, not because he was frightened of dying, and said, the evidence has now become clear. My life's work is wrong. There is a plan. There is a creation here. It's inescapable. The scientific evidence is there. I have to say I'm wrong. And he died without any religion. He didn't believe he was going to go to heaven or anything like that. He just said, there is a grand plan. Believe it. Take it on board. And there's lots of people like that. The majority of people who are scientifically trained in the USA, for example, either believe in a creator or are completely open to the idea. Only minority have rejected it.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic for sure. And when you look at the details of the sun, moon, earth system, yeah, you can kind of rule out randomness as the factor. But if we are if there are no other intelligent humanoid creatures in the universe of any kind, what's the deal with this God, this creator, this higher being, where obviously there's some type of life that isn't human?
Not so, no. I mean, that's a very, very ancient argument. Thomas Aquinas sort of dealt with that one a long time ago. That you can't say because there is a God, there must have something gone before it. So who created God? And the Bible was originally in the plural, that God was talking amongst there was a group of them talking and said, let us create man in our image. It was all plural. But that's just folklore, of course, but it's interesting. But I think there is a force there, and there are candidates. It's possible to philosophize about candidates, but I think it's important just not to try and solve that one. First of all, you've got to accept, is it random? Are we just the sort of result of complete happenstance of just lumps of atoms crashing into one another from this presumed Big Bang? Or is there a God of Judaism, of Christianity, of Islam, Hinduism, whatever? Or is there something different? Is there just a pattern? Is there a plan? Well, religion's in its own place, and it's got its people that are adherents have got their own beliefs based in revelation of people and prophets gone in the past, and that's fine, and that's for them to believe in. But if you have a scientific bent, you've actually got to say, well, what does the science tell me? Well, actually, the science tells you that there is a pattern, that the notion of randomness is perverse. You're being silly, basically. Of course, you can be lazy and just sort of say, well, it sounds reasonable to say it's all just chaos and accident. Well, actually, no, it doesn't fit the facts. So if you're interested in facts, you've got a tension. And if you find it difficult then to sort of identify who I call it this entity God, but so just for want of a better word, you can't identify who the God is. Well, that's your problem. It doesn't stop the fact that something or somebody or whatever you want to call it has done it. It's like you find somebody who's been very clearly murdered. Just because you can't work out what the murder is doesn't mean they weren't murdered.
Yeah.
You've got to take the facts as you find them.
That is true, and it does seem like the earth peoples just like an apple tree apples. But you do entertain a few other ideas in who built the moon as to who it could have been or what it could have been. And my favorite idea is human time travelers. But as out there as it could be, how could that be possible if the moon is needed to sustain life on the planet? Doesn't that kind of create a paradox if we're to assume humanity started on the earth?
No, there's no paradox there at all. Only an apparent paradox, because most people aren't very good at dealing with apparent paradoxes.
That's me.
Yeah, that's most people. I mean, like, try and do a self-help course in quantum mechanics, you'll probably get confused because it's not entirely simple or logical. The only theory, and I put out 3 in Who Built the Moon as potential candidates, the only one that is scientifically squeaky clean is the human time travel one, because all serious scientists now accept that travel backwards in time is possible and will become possible, not necessarily for individuals, for people to do it, but for materials to do it, for sure. I don't think there's anybody that's sort of really serious suggesting that that isn't the case. So if at some point in the future we became capable of sending some sort of drones back that could create mini black holes, and I'm being poetic here, I don't know what I'm talking about really, to hoover up chunks of the Earth's crust to create the moon to the right density and then place it in the right position, they could do that. So it's the only one that fits the facts, because another one is that the God of religion just did it miraculously, but that doesn't actually help, or that aliens from somewhere else came and did it. But you're talking about very, very early on in the development of after the Big Bang, and where would these people have come from, or these creatures come from? Why would they have done it? And why invent something that doesn't exist? We know humans exist. We know time travel is entirely accepted as a scientific possibility. So why invent these little green men from the planet Zog when there's no evidence at all for any life of any description, even microbes out there? So it's a case of just going for the most rational answer for me on that. So that's where I was when I wrote Who Built the Moon. Each of my books, my own thinking matures and changes, and I'm really love to hear from anyone that's got other ideas. But let's agree on the facts first, and then we can all debate the possibilities.
That's a fair point. And I, too, was an atheist for a long time, and I had psychedelic experiences that kind of shook me from that core belief. But I guess in this context of the moon, if someone built it, wouldn't the idea of intelligent humanoid creatures be more likely than a supreme spiritual entity? Because at least we know that intelligent humanoids exist. We don't really have the same evidence of highly intelligent spiritual entities existing.
Well, I think, again, you're trying to rationalize it in terms of the traditions of Western cultural thought, which is entirely logical. But I'm not talking about a spiritual entity, spiritual in the sense of a benign figure that looks after us and looks down and is stationed somewhere and that cares about us on a one-for-one basis. It could just be the cold logic of the material that brought itself into existence to have a determination to transcend the end of the universe. We're told by scientists that you project everything forward and we will end up with all matter evenly dispersed everywhere as a series of atoms, a tiny bit above absolute zero of porridge of nothingness. Now, supposing if the universe had somehow created itself at this big bang point when there was nothing and then there was something, there was time, there was matter, and there was this explosion, and somehow this, and I'm being poetical here, but this material decided that it didn't want to have this fate of being this equally dispersed porridge just above absolute zero. Therefore, it had to get an intelligent bit of itself. Now, human beings are the earth. We are part of the earth. We think of ourselves as being on the earth, but we're not. We are the earth.
Right.
So we're like the neurons, the intelligent, the brain of the earth, if you like. Us and other higher animals. And all animals are one. All life is one on the earth, for my money, that is. And we're on this surface of the earth, like the cells on a brain. And what if we're charged to become intelligent enough to really understand how to steer the course and direction of the whole universe? Is that our mission? If it is, we've got to stop doing these silly, crazy things we do to nearly wipe ourselves out. We've got a bigger responsibility if that's the case. And I also believe from my research is that there is information and text and communications from this force embedded in us that we need to release and can release to take instruction of what we need to do. And we're just part of this greater force. Now, that's very philosophical, and people, can disagree with that, obviously, because it's yet to be anything approaching proof. But the suggestions are all there. Mm-hmm. So it transcends religious thought per se, but it's not. It doesn't displace religious thought. I think they can be bedfellows.
That's fair. Yeah, I could see how that could be. And DNA does point to some type of code too. That is an interesting thread. But another thing you wrote in the Who Built the Moon book that caught my attention was this little paragraph here. You said, perhaps the values programmed into the earth by the unidentified creative agency were so fundamental that any intelligent life form evolving on the earth would respond to them. The relatively recent discovery that pendulums go haywire during a total eclipse could point to brief interruptions of this earthly harmony. And I didn't know this about pendulums, but I have had guests that talk about the importance of the eclipses and even equate them to some sort of system reset or hack. And it could be an interesting clue. What are your thoughts on this?
I like to, over the years, dig out the facts, but to get to a fact can take tens of years. It can, and you may never get there anyway.
Right.
On the journey, I've spotted odd things, weird things, or things that don't quite fit, and you can't make sense of them. So you park them up in the corner over here in the top left-hand corner of your brain, and you carry on. And then 15 years later or whatever, something pops up and you think, I think I know that piece fits in the jigsaw puzzle now. And pendulums are like that. I had to look into pendulums. Thomas Jefferson used pendulums. It's the way of measuring. It's the basis of all measurements to swing a pendulum because it's so mathematically perfect and precise. But as you say, as I report in Who Built the Moon, they go haywire, or they can go haywire during total eclipses. And no one fully understands that. And there's no particular understanding or reason as to why that should be. And it sort of points, this is something in the corner of my mind, I'm waiting to find out what it might mean. It sort of points to there is some change in the way gravity is experienced. And of course, we don't really understand gravity. There's been some good progress made recently into understanding the nature of gravity. But this long distance acting, very weak force, it's to do with the mass of objects, but it changes under this once the moon passes in front of the sun, for example, and shields the Earth in its normal daylight condition from the rays of the sun or the gravity of the sun. They can go, woo, but nothing else can make them do that. Earthquakes can make them shudder, of course, but there's something going on, and it's well worthy of fuller investigation. But I'm just like Thomas Jefferson. I'm a curious amateur. That would take some serious physicists, astrophysicists to investigate.
Right, but there are some seriously interesting threads there. Definitely over my head, for sure. But
yeah, too, yeah.
Another interesting aspect of your work is that this measurement system isn't just reserved for ancient things. It's also embedded in Washington, D.C. You mentioned it a little bit ago, but we know Freemasons played a huge part in this setup. What can you tell us about its incorporation into Washington, D.C.?
The interesting thing is that the ancient structures, such as I was describing, these henges in England, Stonehenge included, they exhibit the use of this so-called Megalithic Yard, identified by Alexander Thom, 82.966 of a meter, centimeters, 82.966 centimeters, incredibly accurate. And they were used in units of 366. Now, I'd been looking at henges all over Western Europe for patterns of using this system, and 732 around the circumference, which is double the number of megalithic yards for the horizon. Getting complicated there. But I happened to look at Washington, D.C., and I was looking at the city from Skype from above. I was looking for something, because I was about to go to Washington, D.C., and I was looking for something else, and I spotted this sort of circle, which includes the vice president's residence. And I thought, whoa, that looks remarkably like a henge. And it was a henge, but it was built by the U.S. Navy.
Wow.
And it was built by the U.S. Navy back in the 19th century to create naval charts. And they had built it to megalithic standards and units. And I thought, that is seriously weird.
Yeah.
Then I came further down into the city itself and started looking at the layout of the design. And the whole damn thing is built using megalithic yards and 366 units between all of this DuPont circle and every little bit of the city. And then from the park south of the White House, there is an ellipse. In the center of this ellipse, which is mega important, is an exact number of megalithic seconds of arc to the Capitol building. And then to the center of the Pentagon and back again is exactly 33 degrees. Now, that's pretty weird in itself, and I'm talking to an accuracy of inches. And the door to the Pentagon faces directly to the Capitol building. So I started to look into the Pentagon, because that's obviously the most recent. The part by the White House has had a very strange history. But you think, well, the Pentagon, of course, was only built at the beginning of the Second World War, very rapidly indeed. So you look at FDR, Roosevelt, building that. Now, he was a 33rd degree Freemason. 32nd at the time, he became 33rd degree. And he designed the Pentagon and its location. It was going to be built at a place called Roslyn, just a little bit north of Pratt's Bottom, where it's now built. The place, it was called Pratt's Bottom. And Roslyn, they'd started building in Roslyn because they knew the war was coming. And they knew they needed a headquarters for the military and intelligence into the new hub. Mm-hmm. And Franklin D. Roosevelt said, stop. I don't want it there. I want it down here. And he pointed to a place that was all bog and it was completely derelict and unsuitable. And they said, Mr. President, that's ridiculous. And he said, look, who's the boss around here? I want it there, exactly building like this, and I want it building to this design. And the design that he insisted upon using is a design specified in the 32nd degree of Freemasonry, which represents the 5 factors of the forces of defense of the United States of America. And it faced the Capitol building. And because it was built there, it fits into this ancient old design for the city that stems right back. And even the Second World War Memorial that was built in this century conforms precisely to these ancient measurements. So whoever's doing it, still planning it, and still well aware of the units that they need to use and the patterning that they need to use. So as a Freemason, I've been on television and radio in the US and giving talks so many times to people who said, is there a Masonic conspiracy? And I said, don't be ridiculous. But there isn't. It's pretty harmless. But then this happens. So I spoke to a friend of mine who's a 33rd degree Freemason in the US and said, what can you tell me about what goes on? Because I can find anything I want about any of the degrees. But the 33rd degree gets a bit difficult. I'm a member of the 33rd degree, but not of the Scottish Rite. Of a different rite. So he explained to me that they actually took their instructions from somebody that came from outside, from the Supreme Council. Who do they take the instructions from? They take it from somebody outside. Where does he come from? Well, nobody knows. And he tells you what to do and think, and there's no voting, there's no argument, you just do it. Yes.
Wow.
Who is he? We don't know. What?
Wow. So at the top of Freemasonry, they're basically just listening to some puppet master, some supreme council that they don't even ask questions about where it comes from. I'm
not going to get popular for saying that, but because I've spent so many years defending Freemasonry. And it isn't Freemasonry because, strictly speaking, there are only sort of 4 official degrees and the Scottish Rite isn't officially Freemasonry. But I spent a lot of years tracing back the original degrees of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and they're actually very different in large parts of the ones that are used today. They've been changed out of sight. And the original ones are far more interesting. But it does appear that there is a conspiracy, for want of a better word, and despite being called conspiratorial, I'm not. But I don't know what's going on, but it appears to be a beneficial conspiracy of trying to draw things together for the benefit of people generally in the way that they see their interpretation of what is right. So I don't think there's anything, my reading is there's nothing negative about it. I mean, Washington's a beautiful city and they've built that, and that's great.
It is, but it's caused a lot of damage in the world too.
Well, that's the politics that come out of Washington that's obviously fully debatable. Now, whether these people also have an overview, I mean, they certainly had control, it would appear, over Roosevelt. And you wonder what else they have influence over.
Right.
But I really don't know the answer. Again, I'm just bringing up the facts and, let others join in the discussion about what it actually means.
Fair. I get that. Awesome. Well, I can't thank you enough, man. I really do appreciate it. A great show hinges on a great guest, so I couldn't do it without you. But would you like to remind the people where they can get your books and anything else you have going on?
I don't have a website because I don't have time with my proper job, my proper company. But obviously, all bookshops, Amazon or whatever, in Kindle or print version, God's Blueprint being the recent one, Civilization 1 being the book that kicked this whole measurement thing off. And it isn't too intimidating in terms of numbers, Who Built the Moon and various other ones. But God's Blueprint, I think, covers my change from being an atheist to believing in something quite huge. So Amazon, I guess, or any bookshop.
Right on. Amazing. Well, Chris, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Mad respect. Take care of yourself out there.
Thanks, Greg. Good to talk.
All right, people, there we go. Now that is a THC I feel like we can be proud of, right?